Today we're learning about sensation and perception, chapter 5. First, let's start with learning a little bit about what sensation means and what perception means, and then we'll look at the difference. Sensation is when sensory information is detected by a sensory receptor. So you are not aware of sensation. All that happens is the light hits your light receptor or the sound hits the sound receptors, but you have not perceived anything during sensation. The conversion from the sensory stimulus to the action potential in your neurons is known as transduction. When this happens, you're still not aware of it. It's still just sensation. An absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimulus that must be present for it to be detected half of the time. This is pretty interesting because you might not think you would be able to hear a watch ticking 20 feet away, but half the time the average person can. If you look at the chart, we can also see a candle flame 30 miles away. We can feel a bee's wing falling 1 centimeter onto our cheek. But remember, that's half the time, the absolute threshold. Smell 1 drop of perfume in a 3-room house, or taste 1 teaspoon of sugar dissolved into 2 gallons of water. So they've done research to determine the absolute threshold of these 5 senses. A message that comes in below that threshold is said to be subliminal, meaning that we receive the message, it's there, but we never become consciously aware of it. So now's where we sort of are kind of tapping into the perception side of it, right? If we're detecting a stimulus, that's some perception. We're perceiving that we see it. Same with a subliminal message, we're not perceiving it. So not the same, the opposite could be said of a subliminal message, that we're not perceiving it. The just noticeable difference, or the difference threshold, is how much difference in stimuli is required to detect a difference between them. So it changes depending on the stimulus intensity. So the higher that the intensity is, the harder it is to notice a difference between them. Let's talk about perception now, as opposed to sensation, which is just the physiological seeing or hearing of something. But let's talk about the perception, which is the way sensory information is organized, interpreted, and most importantly, consciously experienced. How do we experience what our senses are sensing? That's our perception, how we perceive it. There's 2 main ways that we can perceive sensory stimuli. There's top down or bottom up. Let's actually start with bottom up. Bottom up perception is where the smell or the sound or the noise, that sensory stimulus, is what starts the whole process. So we sense the stimuli and then we put it all together. So first we hear the crashing sound, it interrupts our conversation, and then we realize that must have been the waiter dropping all the dishes, right? First, our attention is drawn to the flashing lights in the room, and then we realize it must be some sort of alarm. Top-down processing, on the other hand, is when we have expectation or a goal or previous experience, and we're being purposeful in our seeking of stimuli. In the example in the picture, the man is looking for his keys. So he's looking for something that looks like keys in places where he may have put his keys, right? He's not looking in the toilet. He's not looking in his up on top of the ceiling fan. He's looking under the couch or on the floor, on the counter, places where keys might be. And he's not looking for something huge or something furry or something shaped like a box. He's looking for something small shaped like keys. This is top-down perception because he knows what he's looking for, right? Same thing if you're listening for something. You know that what you're listening for, it's purposeful, so it's top-down. The way I like to remember this is top-down starts in your head, starts in your brain and goes down to your body that's seeking out that sensory stimuli. Moving on to inattentional blindness. This is one of my favorites. I think it's so cool. If you haven't watched the basketball video yet, you must watch it. There's a link to it in your textbook, or you could just search inattentional blindness video and the basketball one will surely come up. Inattentional blindness is the failure to notice something that's completely visible, that's right there, because you're attending to something else. You totally missed something that was going on that would have been totally possible for you to see, but you missed it because you were paying attention to something else. It's like you were blind because you were not paying attention. Inattentional blindness. Sensory adaptation is another form of perception, or another thing that happens with perception. And that's basically when we get used to a noise or a visual stimulus or even a smell, right? If you've been baking chocolate chip cookies all day long, you might not even notice anymore that it smells like chocolate chip cookies. But when somebody comes over, they'll notice it immediately. It's new, so it's a lot more noticeable. In the picture, the lady has gotten used to the loud sound of the air conditioner and she's able to read her book. So what's the difference between sensation and perception? The information comes in, and first, sensation happens. The raw data is processed by our sensory receptors, which are located in our ears, eyes, nose, skin, and tongue. After that raw data is processed and sent to our brain, then the perception happens. The sensations are processed in the brain. In our example, the Christmas tree exists. It sends light waves to our eyes. Our eyes send it back through our neurons to our brain, to the occipital lobe of our brain, where we perceive that information, and then we figure out that it's a tree. Just our eyes looking at it doesn't give any sort of meaning to it. Our brain puts all of that information together where we can process it as perception. The reason that we need to learn about waves is that both visual and auditory stimuli occur in the form of waves. We can have sound waves or auditory waves. In both cases, they're shaped like this. And in fact, I just screenshotted right out of the book because I really like the way that they explain waves. And their diagrams are great too. It shows that the crest is the very top and the trough is the very bottom of the wave. And the wavelength is the distance between crests. The wavelength is also known as the frequency, and that's how the distance between the waves, or how often the waves happen in a given period of time. The amplitude, on the other hand, is how tall the wave is, from the bottom of the trough to the top of the crest. So wavelength goes crest to crest, and amplitude goes trough to crest. Basically, the wavelength is how the space between waves, and the amplitude is how tall or how big the waves are. When we're seeing things, we'll notice that the wavelength is what determines color, and the wave amplitude determines brightness. When we're hearing things, the wavelength determines pitch, and the amplitude determines how loud the sound is. But we'll get to those details a little bit later. This says that wavelength is directly related to the frequency of a given waveform. So frequency is the number of waves that pass a given point in a time period. Frequency is often expressed in hertz. Those are the units of measurement, hertz, or often cycles per second. Longer wavelengths have lower frequencies, right? The longer the wavelength, the more stretched out it is, the less times it occurs in the same period of time. Does that make sense? And the shorter wavelengths have higher frequencies because they're happening very, very often, so there's not a lot of space between them, like the blue example in the picture. The red example, however, shows long wavelengths and short frequencies, or small frequencies. All right, moving on. Light waves. First we'll talk about light waves and then a little bit about vision. The visible spectrum is the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that we can see. We can look at this whole electromagnetic spectrum of light waves that exist and look at that teeny tiny little portion, that little rainbow stripe between the bee and the snake. That's the only portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that human beings can see. And then it's split up into colors, right? The shortest wavelengths are purple, moving on to blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. The longest ones are red in the rainbow order, starting with red as the longest. If you look back up to the bee and the snake, it shows that different species can see different portions of the spectrum. So bees, for example, can see the ultraviolet rays, and some snakes can see infrared waves. I think I said rays, I meant waves. So all of this to say that there is a huge spectrum of light waves that exist, and each species can only see a very small portion of it. As human beings, we can see what's called the visible spectrum, and it ranges from purple to red. And as I mentioned earlier, the amplitude of our light waves is how bright or intense the color is, whereas the wavelength tells us what the color is. So amplitude is brightness, wavelength is color. Now let's talk about sound waves. The frequency of the sound wave is the pitch, and then the amplitude is the loudness, how loud something is. So for frequency, remember that high frequency means that there's a lot of waves in one section. So actually a short wavelength is a high frequency. And high frequency sound waves sound like high-pitched sounds, whereas low frequency sound waves sound like low-pitched sounds. Easy to remember. The loudness is the amplitude, how tall those waves are from trough to crest. The amplitude is how loud we hear it, how loud something is, and we can measure loudness in decibels. There's an example on the right side of different decibel measurements of different sounds. For example, a whisper is 30 decibels. A lawnmower would be 80 to 100, all the way up to a jet or a fireworks show at 140 decibels. And as you can see by the color code on the chart, the higher the decibels go, the more likely you are to get hearing damage from it. So very high decibel sounds should not be listened to for a long time, or you could have hearing damage, which we'll also talk about later. Finally, timbre is a different aspect of sound, and it refers to the sound's purity. It's affected by frequency, amplitude, and the timing of the waves as well. We won't go into the details of timbre, but the timbre of a musical instrument is what allows you to detect the difference between different instruments. The instruments might play the same note, but you can still tell the difference between the sound of a piano or a trumpet or a violin. In terms of the biological aspects of vision and even the neurological aspects, I don't need you to learn every little detail about how the sensory information is processed. I'd basically like you to know the information on this slide, which is that the visual system constructs a mental representation of the world around us, and the way it does this is by light waves entering our eye through the pupil, being focused by the lens on the fovea, which is part of our retina, and it's full of rods and cones. The rods and cones then lead to the ganglion cells, which transmit the information down the optic nerve to the optic chiasm, and finally bringing the information to the occipital lobe of our brain, where vision is processed. So you don't need to understand all of the details of how this happens, as long as you know the general pathway. It goes pupil, lens, fovea, optic nerve, optic chiasm, occipital lobe, right? And we have those ganglion cells in between our rods and cones. And cones are what help us see in light with color, whereas rods help us see in the dark or dimly lit situations. And rods also help us see movement in our periphery, our peripheral vision. If you'd like more information on how vision works, the book has lots of information, and I can post a video as well if you're interested. Moving on to color vision, and then we'll talk about depth. There's two theories of how we see color, and it's not that one is right and one is wrong. They're both right and they're both true, and we're still working to understand them even more. Trichromatic theory tells us that all the colors in the spectrum can be produced by combining red, green, and blue. And if you've ever used a printer that uses red, green, and blue ink, you know that this is true, right? They call it yellow, cyan, and magenta, but those three colors can mix to make any color in the world. And the trichromatic theory of color vision tells us that there are three types of color receptor cones. Remember, the cones help us see color and the rods help us see in darkness. There's specialized cones to see red, specialized cones that see green, and specialized cones that see blue, and that all the colors we perceive can be created by combining the light that hits these cones. And while this is true, we also have found that color can be coded in these opponent pairs. And I'll show you an example of that in a moment that's kind of cool. They've found that there's black-white neurons, yellow-blue ones, and green-red ones. And the different neurons, or the different cells, can be excited by one of the opponent colors and inhibited by the other. What this means is that you have red-green neurons that when you see red, the red part gets excited and the green part gets inhibited. And when you see green, the green part gets excited and the red part gets inhibited. And one way that we can sort of see in our real life that this is true is that we never see a reddish green or a bluish yellow, right? That's just not a thing. We can't really see red and green at the same time in the same color. So both of these theories, trichromatic theory and opponent process theory, help explain how the visual stimuli is converted into the perception of color. And maybe I'll post an article. There's a lot of really interesting research out there about color perception. Let's do a little experiment about those neurons that I was just talking about that help us see the opposite color sometimes. It's demonstrated with an after image. An after image is defined as the continuation of a visual sensation after removal of the stimulus. But in fact, it's not just a continuation, it's actually sort of the opposite picture. Let's see how it works. Take a look at the girl's picture here on the left and stare at her nose. You'll notice there's red and green and blue dot on her nose. Just stare at her nose, keep staring, don't look away, stare at her nose, and in one moment when I tell you to, you're going to shift your focus to the blank white part of the screen. Ready? Okay, go. If it didn't work, try one more time. Look at her nose, and then look at the white part. What's neat for me is that I sort of see the picture floating away. I see the girl in full color, but she floats up off to the right part of the screen, which is interesting. I wonder if that happens for all of you. Let's do one more example. As a proud Canadian, when I found this example, I had to include it. Stare at that green maple leaf. Stare at the green maple leaf. And now look over at the white part, and hopefully you will see a red maple leaf. So just like we learned that black and white were opposite, we also learned red and green are opposite, right? Just as blue and yellow are opposite. So since I'm staring at the green, once I look at the after image, it'll be shown in red. Feel free to pause or go back and try again if it didn't work for you, because it should work. I'm going to keep going to depth perception, right? We are looking at this picture here on the right-hand side of a hand. It's just a bunch of flat lines. There's no actual depth to that picture, yet we can totally perceive the depth of the hand sticking out, right? The way that we perceive depth is sometimes with both eyes and sometimes with one. A binocular cue relies on two eyes, and one way that we can perceive depth is with binocular disparity. We see a slightly different view of the world with each eye. If you want to notice this, you can close one eye now and then switch, and you'll notice that the screen moves slightly in your line of vision. We see a little bit differently with both eyes, and the difference between these views allows us to perceive depth. However, we also can see depth with just one eye. If you close one eye and walk around your house, you probably won't bump into things, and that's because we have what's called linear perspective. Linear perspective perceives depth when two parallel lines seem to converge. That's sort of what's happening in this picture on the slide, and it's what happens when we learn to draw a street going off into the distance, and we draw our two lines getting closer and closer as the road moves further away from the viewer. I want to talk about a case study real quick about a man named Bridgman who was not able to see depth for most of his life. Let me read you this short article. It's quite interesting, and I'd like you to know about it. On February 16th, 2012, a man named Bridgman went to the theater with his wife to see this movie Hugo. It was a 3D movie. Like everyone else, he paid a surcharge for a pair of glasses, thinking they would be a complete waste of money. Bridgman, a 67-year-old neuroscientist at the University of California, grew up nearly stereo blind. that is, without true perception of depth. When we'd go out and people would look up and start discussing some bird in the tree, I would still be looking for the bird when they were finished, he said. For everybody else, the bird jumped out. But to me, it was just part of the background. All that changed when the lights went down and the previews finished. Almost as soon as he began to watch the film, the characters leapt from the screen in a way he had never experienced. It was just literally like a whole new dimension of sight. Exciting, says Bridgman. But this wasn't just movie magic. When he stepped out of the cinema, the world looked different. For the first time, Bridgman saw lampposts standing out from the background. Trees, cars, and people looked more alive and more vivid than ever. And remarkably, he's seen the world in 3D ever since that day. Riding to work on my bike, I looked into a forest beside the road and see a riot of depth, every tree standing out from all the others, he says. Something had happened. Some part of his brain had awakened. So this man was not able to see depth for his whole entire life, and at 67 years old, he went to a 3D movie, and pretty soon after the movie started, he was able to see it in 3D with the glasses, and even after he took his glasses off, he was able to see depth for the rest of his life. It was like this part of his brain had been awakened, like they said, right? Like these neurons that had not been activated before were now activated. I bet he regretted not going to a 3D movie sooner. All right, that sums up our vision portion of the chapter. Again, with the biological part of hearing, you don't need to know a lot. I mostly want you to know the definition that our auditory system converts pressure waves into meaningful sounds, and then the order that the sound waves travel. They go into the auditory canal, to the tympanic membrane. They vibrate the ossicles, which lead to which move around the water or the liquid in the cochlea, which move the hair cells in the basilar membrane, which lead to the auditory nerve and eventually the temporal lobe of our brain. So as long as you know that order, auditory canal, tympanic membrane, ossicles, cochlea, hair cells in the basilar membrane, auditory nerve, temporal lobe, you're all good. And you don't even need to know the 3 names of the ossicles. Sound localization is, to me, it's sort of like the equivalent of depth, but for hearing instead of vision. Sound localization allows us to figure out where the sound is coming from. Some of us are better at this than others. In fact, my mom is really terrible at sound localization. Somebody's phone could ring across the restaurant and she's digging in her purse. She's convinced it's her phone ringing. Anyway, in order to perceive sound localization and figure out where a sound is coming from, our auditory system uses both monaural and binaural cues, right? Monaural being one-eared and binaural being two-eared. You don't really need to understand exactly how this happens. Just understand it's sort of like with our depth. The 2 ears are figuring out the difference between the sound that arrives at both of the ears, which allows us to calculate the distance in our head or the location. And the one ear is getting information as well, and certain frequencies coming in at different angles. But again, we don't need to know the details of this. Just know that in order to figure out where a sound comes from, we use both monaural and binaural cues. Hearing loss. I have a picture on the left of a character from the TV show Switched at Birth, which if you haven't watched it yet, it can be a bit of a cheesy show, but I actually really enjoyed it. And it does a wonderful job of explaining deaf culture. I've spoken to a few deaf friends and a friend who works with the deaf community, and they all agree that Switched at Birth does a really excellent job of explaining deaf culture and using true ASL with proper subtitles and really opening us up to the world of deaf culture. So if you're interested, feel free to watch that show. Just a suggestion. Congenital deafness is deafness that you're born with, deafness from birth. Conductive hearing loss is the failure in the vibration of the eardrum or the movement of the ossicles. It's a physical cause of deafness, and this is the kind that can be treated with hearing aids. Sensorineural hearing loss, on the other hand, is the failure to transmit the signals from the cochlea to the brain. This one cannot be treated with hearing aids, although it can sometimes be treated with cochlear implants. The textbook does a good job of explaining deaf culture as well, and the pros and cons of ASL, lip reading, and cochlear implants. So basically there are 3 ways that somebody could not be able to hear. You could be deaf from birth, congenital deafness. You could go deaf or hard of hearing due to physiological reasons, which is called conductive hearing loss. And you could go deaf or become hard of hearing due to sensorineural hearing loss, which is related to the neural signals being sent from the cochlea to the brain, and that cannot be treated with hearing aids. Okay, we are done with the 2 main senses that we are learning about today, vision and hearing. We'll learn about taste and smell, and then we'll move on to touch real quick, but I promise we're almost done. Taste is also called gustation, and smell olfaction. Both of these are considered chemical senses because both have sensory receptors that respond to molecules, either the molecules in the food, which get dissolved in our saliva, or the molecules in the air. Taste molecules can bind to the receptors on our taste buds. They cause chemical changes within the sensory cell that result in neural impulses being transmitted to the brain via different nerves. We often hear about sweet, salty, sour, and bitter. There's also something called umami, which is a type of taste that allows us to taste MSG and things like soy sauce. Can fall into that category of umami. And they also mention in the book that some researchers believe that we have taste buds for fatty foods as well. Interestingly, taste buds have a life cycle of only 10 days to 2 weeks. So if you burn your tongue and burn off those taste buds, don't worry, they'll be back. Moving on to our smell, the olfactory receptor cells, of course, are located in our nose. There's small hair-like extensions from these receptors that serve as the sites for the odor molecules dissolved in our mucus to interact with the chemical receptors. So sort of like how the taste molecules get dissolved in our saliva to be brought in by the receptors, the olfactory receptor cells are reacting to the the dissolving in the mucus. The odor molecules dissolving in the mucus. That's pretty much all we need to know about taste and smell. Let's talk about touch and pain for a moment. You don't need to know the specifics of the different receptors in the picture on the left. We have the Messner corpuscle and all of that. You don't need to know what each one does. Just know that those are different types of touch receptors that we have in our skin. And then we have thermoceptors and nociceptors that are actually more open nerve endings and allow us to perceive temperature and pain. So thermoception is the perception of temperature, and nociception is the perception of pain or potential harm. There's 2 types of pain that your nociceptors can perceive or can sense and then send to your brain to perceive. One is inflammatory pain, which is a signal that some type of tissue damage has occurred, like you stub your toe or cut your finger. And then neuropathic pain is pain from damage to the neurons in the peripheral or central nervous system. This is something more like fibromyalgia, something that's actually a neuronal type of pain or neuropathic pain. One more definition we should know is congenital analgesia, born without the ability to experience pain. So these people can detect differences in temperature and pressure. It's not that they don't feel anything. They can feel things on their skin, on their body. They just don't experience pain. So they would feel a lot of pressure if somebody broke their arm, but it wouldn't hurt. And the result is repeated or significant injuries. As you can imagine, if you don't feel pain, it's really easy to get hurt or to get very badly hurt. I find congenital analgesia very interesting. So again, you don't need to know all the details of the different receptors. Just know that there's the receptors in the skin that can feel things like pressure or stretching or vibration or touch. And then we have the open nerves, the open-ended nerves that sense temperature and pain. All right, moving on to our vestibular system. Proprioception is the perception of our body position, how we're positioned and where we are. And then the kinesthesia is the perception of our body's movement. So proprioception is where we are, and kinesthesia is our moving. And both of these perceptions interact with the information that's provided to us by our vestibular system. So just like our vision is interacted by the information provided by our eyes, and our sense of smell interacts with the information that is given to us through our nose, the vestibular system provides the information that we need for proprioception and kinesthesia. And the vestibular section is located right next to the cochlea in the inner ear. You may have heard before that your inner ear provides balance, and that's your vestibular system, is what provides the sense of balance. As you can see by the girl in the balance beam, she must have a very good vestibular system, or well-trained vestibular system. The vestibular organs are fluid-filled and also have hair cells like the nose and the ears, and similar to the ones in the auditory system. So the vestibular system works in a similar way, especially in terms of the hair cells, as the auditory system. But again, don't worry about the details, and certainly don't worry about the names of the different parts on the diagram. Just know the general definitions of proprioception, kinesthesia, and vestibular system. Last slide before our summary. Gestalt is the idea that a whole is different than the sum of its parts. So not necessarily better, just different. And it literally means a form or a pattern. So there's different theories of pattern perception, which is our ability to discriminate among different figures and shapes. This happens because of different Gestalt principles, including proximity, similarity, continuity, closure, and connectedness. The book does a great job of explaining this, but you don't need to really know much more than that our brain, Gestalt psychology, explains how our brain perceives different patterns, and that we do it following different principles without ever having been taught these principles. It's just a natural thing. So for example, in the picture, we see the dots on the bottom, on the very bottom, as 3 sets of 2 because they're connected to each other. Or we see the purple dashes as a triangle rather than just a bunch of purple dashes. Our brain combines things into a whole instead of just a sum of parts. All right, that is it for chapter 5. I'm going to go through the summary. Feel free to stop the video now and come back and watch the summary before the quiz. Sensation is what happens when sensory information is detected by a sensory receptor. Remember, we don't know anything's happening when sensation occurs. Perception, however, is the way that sensory information is interpreted and consciously experienced. We do know that perception is happening. Transduction is the conversion from a sensory stimulus to action potential. So the energy that comes in from the light or from the sound waves turns into the action potential and provides that neuronal message, the neural communication. Transduction, that's what I just said, sorry. Absolute threshold is the minimum amount of stimulus energy that must be present for the stimulus to be detected 50% of the time. Remember, that was the ticking watch from 20 feet away, or the drop of perfume in a 3-bedroom house. That's the absolute threshold. The just noticeable difference is the difference in stimuli required to detect a difference. So between a bright light and a dim light, how different does that brightness need to be for me to notice the difference? Perception is the way the sensory information is organized. I have perception here twice, but that's okay because it's important. I'll take that out before I post the slides. Subliminal message is a message presented below the threshold of conscious awareness. So we don't have any conscious awareness, but yet it may, they're sort of torn on whether it'll have an effect, but just know that subliminal message comes in below the threshold of conscious awareness. There's two types of perception that we can take part in. There's top-down processing, interpreting sensations as influenced by our knowledge, experiences, and thoughts. That's looking for our keys, right? Trying to smell out the stinky trash in the house. We're specifically looking for the stimulus. So that's top-down processing, starts in our brain. Whereas bottom-up processing starts with the sensory input. Our perceptions are built from the sensory input that happens first. Then we figure out what it is. Inattentional blindness is the failure to notice something that's completely visible simply because of a lack of attention. Sensory adaptation is when we get used to something, not perceiving the stimuli after it remains relatively constant for a prolonged period of time. Now talking about waves, the amplitude is the height of the wave and the frequency is the number of waves that pass a given point in a given time period. The visible spectrum is the portion of the larger electromagnetic spectrum that we can see. The visible spectrum is the part humans can see. Remember, different species have different visible spectrums. For light waves, the amplitude of the waves is the brightness and the frequency of the waves is the color. Red has the longest wavelength and purple has the shortest. For sound waves, amplitude is the loudness of the sound measured in decibels, and frequency is the pitch of the sound. High frequency, high pitch, low frequency, low pitch. Timbre is the sound's purity. It's affected by frequency and amplitude as well as the timing of the waves. Timbre is what allows us to hear the difference between two different people's voices or two different instruments. Vision starts when the light wave goes through the pupil hole, is focused by the lens on the fovea, then processed down the optic nerve into the optic chiasm and lands up in our occipital lobe of our brain where we perceive the sound, the sight. Cones are the receptors for light and color, whereas rods are for darkness and periphery movement. Cones and rods can take over at different times. They're always both there, they're always both working, but in dark conditions, rods are doing most of the work, and in light conditions, cones are doing most of the work. Moving on to the right side, how do we see color? Trichromatic theory tells us that all colors in the spectrum can be produced by combining red, green, and blue. So the trichromatic theory of color vision tells us we have specified cones for red, specified cones for green, and specified cones for blue. The opponent process theory tells us that the color is coded in opponent pairs, black and white, yellow, blue, and red and green. So some of our neurons are excited by yellow while inhibited by blue. Other neurons are excited by green and inhibited by red, and vice versa. We can see this when we look at the example of the after image, which is a continuation of a visual sensation after the removal of the stimulus. Remember when we looked at the black and white picture of the girl and it changed to color? We looked at the green maple leaf and it changed to red. That's because of opponent process theory. A binocular cue is a cue that relies on the use of both eyes. One example of this is binocular disparity, which means we have a slightly different view of the world from each eye, and the difference between this allows us to perceive depth. A monocular cue is a cue that requires only one eye. For example, linear perspective. We can perceive depth in an image when two parallel lines seem to converge. Moving on to hearing, the process starts when the auditory waves hit our auditory canal. They go down the auditory canal to the tympanic membrane, where they vibrate the ossicles, which vibrates the liquid in the cochlea, which vibrates the hair cells in the basilar membrane, sending a message down the auditory nerve to the temporal lobe of our brain, where we perceive the sound. The auditory system uses both monaural and binaural cues to localize the sound, figure out where it comes from. Congenital deafness means that you were born deaf. Conductive hearing loss means you lose hearing due to the failure of vibration of either the eardrum or the ossicles. And Conductive hearing loss is the type that can be treated with hearing aids. Sensorineural hearing loss, on the other hand, is about a failure to transmit the neural signals from the cochlea to the brain. This one cannot be treated with hearing aids, but can often be treated with a cochlear implant. Moving on to taste, gustation, and smell, olfaction. These are called our chemical senses. Thermoception is how we sense temperature. Nociception is how we sense pain or potential harm. The two types of pain that our brain can perceive and that our senses can sense are inflammatory pain and neuropathic pain. Inflammatory pain is actual damage to your body, real tissue damage, like a scrape or a cut or an injury. Neuropathic pain, however, is damage to the neurons in either the peripheral or the central nervous system. Congenital analgesia, I always say that wrong, is someone who's born without the ability to experience pain. And of course, since they can't experience pain, they often have repeated or significant injuries. Proprioception is the perception of our body position, and kinesthesia is the perception of our body's movement. Our interaction with the information provided by our vestibular system allows us to perceive our body's position and our movement. The vestibular system is similar to the auditory system, and it's located next to the cochlea in the inner ear. Finally, Gestalt psychology tells us that the whole is different from the sum of its parts, and we use pattern perception to discriminate among different figures and shapes using the different Gestalt theories that we looked at on the previous slide.